Hey, do you like your job? If your answer is yes, then I bet you are not a violin string maker from the 1700s. I know. It sounds like a bizarre theory, but was I right? Being a violin maker in those days was a living hell. Today, violins are made of steel or nylon, but in the past, not everyone could use those materials. Thus, the best solution was to use sheep intestines. How do you turn sheep intestines into violin strings? A violin maker is hired. The task of these craftsmen was to kill and slaughter the sheep, being careful not to damage anything. They would carefully remove the intestines and then spend hours scraping away fat, muscle, and blood vessels. If they did not carefully follow each step of the process, the entrails could rot, ruining all the work. Once this stage was completed, the innards would be dried and patiently woven together, resulting in a violin string. Then they would repeat this 3 or 4 more times. That sounds like a great way to spend a lifetime, although I'm sure there was at least one violin maker in history who really loved his job, going to work each day with a smile. Yay! Today I have to scrape the fat from sheep organs! Life is good. The next topic is about leech collectors. In the past, when it came to medicine, no one really knew what they were doing. It was mainly a mix of guesswork, trial and error, and blindly following whatever theory was in fashion that week. For this reason, in the Middle Ages, a number of wrong practices came into being. One of these was known as bloodletting. Bloodletting consisted of literally opening the patient and draining a large amount of blood. In the Middle Ages, bloodletting was essentially the universal solution for any illness. Feeling a little sick? No problem. Have a stomachache for too long? No problem. In addition to gashing the patient, there was another method used to draw blood, and that was, of course, leeches. These animals were in such demand that an entire industry dedicated to their collection sprang up. But being one of these collectors was not the most ideal job. How would you go about collecting leeches? I imagine they used a bucket, maybe a fishing pole, or a net. No, they would dive directly into the water and let those little suckers stick to them. Because leeches are little suckers. And yes, they would go into the water, stay there for an hour or two, and when they came out, their legs were completely covered with leeches. As you might expect, it was not at all healthy for them. First of all, once a leech attached itself to you, it was difficult to pull it off. The goal of those guys was to allow the leech to feed on blood until it became swollen and big, at which point you could try to remove it. The problem is that leeches consume a lot of blood, so it was not uncommon for a leech collector to get completely full of leeches over the course of a few hours and then pass out in the water because of blood loss. Very entertaining, just an enjoyable job. But you know what would make such a job even more interesting? Tension. You always want to have the feeling of being watched, of never being safe. Fortunately, this is exactly what you will receive from our next trade. These individuals were known as Resurrectionists. In the past, bodies were in extreme demand in the United Kingdom. The demand came from physicians, eager for bodies on which to practice and to use to instruct their apprentices. But unfortunately, legally, the only bodies they could practice on were those of newly executed criminals. But since when did such a triviality as the legal system prevent anyone from pursuing their dreams? Doctors would hire these individuals, the resurrectionists, to locate bodies and deliver them to doctors. In other words, they would purloin the corpses and give them to the doctors. But wasn't that illegal? Yes, apparently not. It turned out that the government didn't really care about the corpses. Of course, publicly they would state that it was illegal and that you should not try to purloin a corpse, but then some corpses were purloined and nobody did anything about it. There was one condition, however. Resurrectionists had to be absolutely sure not to accidentally steal anything of value from the coffin. Removing even a necklace or a coin could have turned the penalty for this crime from a simple warning to a potential felony, punishable by 5 years in prison. Resurrectionists had several interesting strategies for optimizing the theft of corpses. The strategy believed to be most widely used was this. They would dig down to the head of the grave, open the top, tie a rope around the corpse, and pull it out. It seemed a legitimate, quite reasonable strategy. But there was another one. It was described in an article in 1896, and I feel the need to describe it just because of how strange it sounds. They would start not directly over the coffin, but a few meters away. Then they would dig a tunnel slanting toward the coffin. They would then rip the head from the coffin, tie it around the body, and pull it up the tunnel. And here's the most ingenious part. Beyond that, it was just hard work. Every day they ventured into the basement and dipped their arms into whatever mountain of ambiguous-looking fecal waste they could locate. Their greatest danger was, of course, the wild boar lineage that dwelt under the sewers. I reiterate this for those who are a bit behind. Their greatest danger was the wild boar lineage that harassed them and actively tried to eliminate them. This is most likely just a local legend, but it is also something that every single digger who was called a tosher was aware of and worried about. But despite the disgust and danger, tosher work was still surprisingly attractive to many people. Why? Well, the motivation was probably exactly what one would expect: money. These individuals were able to earn a reasonable amount of money simply by exploring sewers. On average, they were bringing home about a couple of dollars every working day. This begs the question, why were people throwing so much money into the underground? And the more important question, do people still continue to throw money into the underground? Well, are you familiar with the term nomenclature? Yes? No? I'm not. In any case, nomenclature means the creation or selection of names for things, especially in science or other disciplines. Surprisingly, this word originated as a profession, the nomenclator. The job of these individuals was to attend parties in Rome and memorize every last detail of every single person who attended. That senator's relative on grandmother's side? I definitely need to remember that. That person's dog's favorite pasta dish? Definitely to keep in mind. Often the work of these individuals, as well as their very existence, depended on knowing the most obscure details about anyone. In other situations, their job was to announce the names of their lords every time they entered a room. Without exception, always. What an extraordinary profession. It would be great to be so well off that I could afford to have someone shout my name every time I crossed the threshold of a room. Real life goals. Okay, that was an interesting fact, but I can make it a little more disturbing. The time has come to discuss galley rowers. In France, around the 19th century, the use of a type of boat called a galley was becoming widespread. However, there was a problem. They needed oarsmen. They had to get oarsmen from somewhere, and what could be better than poor wretches falling victim to the court system? Consequently, it was decided to replace the death penalty with a different form of punishment. Instead of executing criminals, the punishment for their crimes consisted of spending time rowing on galleys. Thus, if one committed murder, one was exposed to years of hard labor on the oars, to give an example. However, these sentences were not greatly respected. If you were sentenced to years for stealing a dog, there was a good chance that you would never see the light of day again. This work was so grueling that more than half of the paddlers simply died. It was an extremely dangerous occupation. They were confined to the bottom of the ship in a cramped and claustrophobic space, rowing for endless hours. They often hurt their muscles, but they had to keep rowing despite everything. Because they were on the lowest level of the ship, they were constantly soaked, and the saltiness consumed their skin. Many of them lost consciousness, were brutally beaten, and never woke up. It seems like a terrible experience, working for hours without food and without a single break. It is truly amazing that people endured this work for more than a day or two, let alone for years. Then we come to the sin consumers. These individuals probably held one of the most explanatory job titles, though still steeped in ambiguity. Their assignment was to consume the sins of the dead. How did they do that? I'm glad you ask. The scene usually took place during some kind of funeral. The hosts, those who organized the funeral ritual, would hire a consumer of sins, often just a young man in need of money. The people attending the funeral would take some kind of food, such as bread or cake, put it in a bowl, and then place the bowl on the deceased. Then they would give the food to the person who would consume it, who would thus take upon himself the sins of the deceased. One could summarize the whole situation as the rich paying the poor to go to hell in their place. And the most unfortunate thing was that consumers of iniquity were often socially marginalized. No one wanted to deal with individuals so burdened with sins. Sounds bad, doesn't it? Well, I think it would have been a good job if I didn't believe all these things. They used to say, "By eating this cake, you will be forever damned to the fires of hell." Oh, all right. I love red velvet. It's chocolate. Since these individuals were considered walking reservoirs of sin, one would expect the church to welcome them warmly for their special abilities. Instead, the Christian church actively drove them out. It turns out that an important source of income for the church of the time came from the removal of sins on behalf of the rich. And with these poor wretches going out of their way for a much lower price, the church suffered a significant drop in its profit margins. This is rather unfortunate to say, considering that it is a church, but it is a fact. If the church identified sinners in the town or village, they were literally eliminated or tortured and then killed. In any case, the prospects for survival seemed slim. Okay, but what is the worst thing about being persecuted by the Catholic Church and ostracized for life? Yes, exactly. Imagine instead of being mauled by mice. This was the fate of the classic Rodent Catcher. These individuals were tasked with keeping the city's rat population in check, a rather interesting task. When you think of rodent catchers, you think of someone who sets rat traps and then comes back later to check if they have caught any, right? A reasonable assumption. But it seems that the people of London had better things to do than wait for mice to get into the trap. Therefore, they hunted mice with their bare hands. This, I think it is safe to say, was not a good idea. Rodent catchers often ended up being bitten by rats, and, as the surprise of surprises, these bites led to deadly diseases. Rodent catchers were frequently affected by rat-borne diseases because of the risks associated with their work. As we all know, wild rats are certainly not the friendliest creatures to be around. Moreover, the Queen of England did indeed have a rodent catcher, but she was not always personally present. In fact, she had trained a monkey, a badger, and 2 ferrets to catch rats. In addition, the rodent catcher's name was Jack Black. Yes, I know. Finally, we come to the salt mine workers. This might seem like a rather random task, but it really struck me while researching. Imagine an ordinary mine with its poor ventilation and cramped, uncomfortable, enclosed spaces. Now take that experience and imagine the air saturated with salt, absorbing moisture from your body. Basically, while you are working, you are in a constant state of dehydration, which, boy, is not fun at all. I'm talking about work to the point of exhaustion. I read on the most authoritative Q&A site of all that hard work can devastate, coal mining can destroy and suffocate, but salt mining must surely devastate, suffocate, tear, and desiccate all at once. YouTube thinks you will like this video, so click on it. And if you have come this far, please subscribe.